Our next exercise, this one's called Sausages with Contour Lines, focuses on those lines that sit on the surface of 3D forms and describe how they curve and warp through 3D space, which I introduced a couple videos ago. We'll also be exploring the concept of sausage structures, which adhere to a specific set of characteristics and will be useful as we get into drawing insects and animals further into the course. Just as with the arrows exercise, we're going to go through the steps of the exercise first, then discuss some additional considerations that you'll want to keep in mind when tackling it. So make sure you go through the entire video at least once before starting on the exercise. To start, we draw a sausage on the page. In the context of this course, a sausage refers to a specific type of organic form. An organic form is a sort of blobby mass, which unlike other more distinct primitive forms like boxes, cylinders, etc., don't have a specific definition beyond being made up of organic curves, so they can come in all kinds of shapes. A sausage specifically is an organic form that is shaped like a cylinder that maintains a consistent width throughout its length, and has two spherical ends that are equal in size. In other words, we want to try to avoid pinching or widening through the midsection. We also want to avoid having our ends be more stretched or flattened, and we want them to be roughly the same size. While throughout this course we should be drawing through all of our ellipses with 2 full turns of the shape before lifting our pen, note that this is only for ellipses. Sausages are not ellipses, and so we draw the shape in one go. Drawing through it here would cause it to come out more ellipsoid, which is not what we're after. These characteristics sound simple, but you'll find that it can be tricky to achieve, especially at first. As with the arrows from the previous lessons, the key is to engage your whole arm from the shoulder and to draw as slowly as you're able without compromising the confidence of your stroke, so as to maintain a smooth execution. When doing so, try to start somewhere along the straighter portion of the sausage. I've found that we often have the instinct to start towards one of the ends, but this requires us to match the same curvature perfectly just as we close the shape. Whereas if we start along the straightaway, we can give ourselves some room to line things up to close things off more seamlessly. Of course, no matter how you tackle it, it is going to take some practice, and you will probably still have some difficulty with this well beyond this lesson. That's entirely expected. As with most things, this is harder than it sounds, but do your best to draw a line that passes through the center of the sausage. It's going to serve as the minor axis to the ellipses and partial curves we draw later. Fortunately, you don't actually have to get this perfect. Similarly to the minor axis line in the funnels exercise from lesson 1, it serves as something for our eyes and brains to use as a reference. Even when it's off, it can serve this purpose by giving us something to compare against, to better understand how the ellipses and curves we'll be drawing should align, and what we should be aiming for. Here's where we get into the contour line aspect of this exercise, where we describe the rounded surface of what is not just a shape on the page, but a form floating in 3D space. This comes in 2 forms. Contour ellipses, where similarly to how we draw through our boxes, as though we have X-ray vision, here we're drawing contour lines that wrap all the way around the form, such that we can see through it. Contour curves, however, are where we only draw the visible portion of the larger ellipse. The homework for this exercise involves both of these, but first we'll look at the contour ellipses. This involves drawing ellipses that fit snugly within the silhouette of the sausage and that are aligned to its central path, the spine that the sausage follows, which is represented by the minor axis line we drew before. Later, we'll talk about what to consider when deciding on the degree of our ellipse, that is, how wide they are, but for now, we're just focusing on executing them confidently so they maintain an even shape, and using the ghosting method so we can keep them as close to touching the sausage's edge as we can. While we always want to be working towards keeping them snug within that shape, if we can't achieve that right now, it's generally better in practice to have them be a little smaller rather than a little larger, for the simple reason that this keeps the ellipses contained within the sausage's silhouette. When they spill outside of the silhouette, it can undermine the solidity of the form, whereas when they're contained, it at least won't have this sort of negative impact. Regardless, we'll always be aiming to get them to fit snugly within that silhouette, touching the edges, because this is how we create the illusion that the line is wrapping around the form's surface. And don't forget, since we're freehanding these, as with all of our freehanded marks throughout this course, be sure to employ the ghosting method and draw through the ellipses 2 full times before lifting your pen. We'll be doing that throughout the entire course. So that's how we approach contour ellipses, and contour curves are very similar, but instead of drawing the full ellipse all the way around the sausage, we'll draw partial curves that represent the portion of the ellipse that would be visible without X-ray vision. What makes this a bit tricky is that without drawing the full ellipse, it can be difficult to maintain the appropriate curvature, and so students are often prone to making curves that are too shallow or that don't accelerate enough as they reach the edge of the sausage. Remember that we're talking about a curved surface in 3D space. In the middle of the silhouette, the surface is pointing towards the viewer, but as we move closer to the edge, the surface is turning away from us at an accelerating rate. So, the curve needs to accelerate as it reaches this edge as well. Ellipses do this naturally, and so instead of having to think about it, we can rely on our muscle memory. Here, we have to be more conscious of achieving that acceleration in our curve, and one thing that can help with that is overshooting the curves. That's not to say they fly off the surface of the sausage and go beyond the silhouette, but rather that we want to draw the part that continues along the other side a little further. So not a full ellipse, but a little more than just the partial curve that would be visible. You can expect to approach it this way for a while, definitely throughout your homework here, but it's also totally fine to keep doing it this way when you practice this exercise as part of your warm-ups throughout the rest of the course. You can of course pull back on it little by little, but it's more important that your arm gets used to drawing that curvature correctly, rather than having the line end at the silhouette's edge. This applies to both types, contour ellipses and contour curves. But basically, being three-dimensional, our sausages don't just run across our field of view. They may also turn to face towards or away from us, the viewer. Placing a small ellipse at the tip can help clarify this, serving as an additional visual cue to better understand how this form sits in 3D space. One thing to keep in mind is that even when drawn alongside contour curves, this smaller ellipse isn't really different from the other curves. Rather, because that end of the sausage is turned towards the viewer, it's just that we're able to see the full way around the contour ellipse rather than only seeing a small portion. Just make sure that the contour curves immediately preceding it aren't drawn in such a way that they tell us this end is actually turned away. Similarly, since the degree of the ellipse corresponds to the orientation of the circle it represents in 3D space, the narrower this ellipse is, the more that tip is pointing across our field of view rather than at the viewer. This means that when the ellipse is on the narrower end, it will actually be closer to the edge of the silhouette, whereas when it's wider, it'll be further from that edge because the end of the sausage is turned more to face the viewer. This actually leads us into the main additional consideration I wanted to discuss before you can get to your homework, which has to do with understanding our intent for how a given sausage is meant to sit within and flow through 3D space. We'll get to that in a moment. As always, the final step is to fill the page with sausages and place contour ellipses or curves within them. The homework assignment for this one, which you'll find in the written material for the course on the website, will have you dedicating each page to one of the two. So generally, you'll be drawing only contour ellipses or only contour curves for a given page. Here I've split the page between contour ellipses and contour curves, but that is just for the sake of demonstration in this video. The concept of an ellipse's degree and what that tells us about the way in which the circle in 3D space it represents is oriented is something we introduced back in Lesson 1's Ellipses section. It goes over this in considerable detail, so I would strongly recommend reviewing that material. For the purposes of this exercise, the main thing to remember is that a sausage that doesn't bend at all behaves like a cylinder, where the further back along its length we sample our cross-sections, the wider their degree will be. Many students get this backwards because perspective tells us that things get smaller as they get further away, but this is not mutually exclusive. Rather, things get smaller overall, but proportionally wider due to how the angle at which we're seeing it changes. On top of the way in which a straight cylinder would behave, as our sausages bend more dramatically, we also would have to take into consideration the relationship between an ellipse's degree and what that tells us about how the circle it represents is oriented in space. The narrower it is, the more it's pointing across our field of view, and the wider it is, the more it's turned to face the viewer head-on. This does mean that you actually will want to think about how you want your sausage to behave as you draw it. Fortunately, most of the sausages you draw here won't bend so dramatically, and so using the behavior of a cylinder, again, where the further away along the sausage we go, the wider the ellipse would be, will work well enough. But beyond this lesson, as you practice the exercise in your warm-ups, you may want to experiment more. And of course, that applies to your contour curves as well, which again are just the visible portion of a larger contour ellipse. As many of you know, Drawabox is a completely free resource that delivers a ton of value on a very limited budget. While one of the major ways students support our efforts is by signing up to our Patreon and allowing some of their official critique credits to expire, checking out the courses, tools, and books listed on our recommendations page is also an excellent way to help us out. When a student uses one of our links to Amazon in Canada and the United States, or Proco.com and makes a purchase, we get paid a commission that helps us out considerably. So, if you're interested in checking out other courses and books, our curated recommendations are a great place to start. The link will be in the description below.